On August 27, at the end of the day, the battalion arrived in the area of the Crestsea station. The column crossed the highway, a small river, and on a new grader deepened into the pine forest. Having received the order for a respite, the soldiers threw off their extra load, rolled up their overcoats, and putting their weapons and bags under their heads, instantly fell asleep. For 3 days we had travelled at least 100 kilometres through swamps and off-road, and were incredibly tired. Although for the last 5 days of fighting and transition we had to be satisfied with only dry rations, no one thought about food. Sleep for us now was the most precious reward. For the time of the transition, our platoon was on combat patrol. It was more like a remnant of the Platoon 2 squads. We marched with the headquarters, moving forward alternately one or the other squad. During breaks we changed their places. After giving the order to take a break, Captain Dementiev collapsed exhaustedly on a fallen pine tree and, after resting for a minute with closed eyes, began to pull off his boots with great effort. Earlier I had thought that this ever-strong man did not know what fatigue was. Now he looked utterly shattered. After napping for about 5 minutes, Dementiev regained his usual condition and turned to the senior political officer Sukik, who was seated next to. "I'm sorry, Commissar. I'm in the board gutted. I've had rheumatism since childhood. Now everything breaks and my bones are buzzing. I broke my legs in the battle. I couldn't communicate in time, so I was running from one flank to the other. A bad head does not give rest to the legs," said the commander, looking at his watch. "But we were lucky. 4 hours earlier came, so 4 hours in our favour, more rest." Dementiev suggested Sukik to find out the situation in the country and at the fronts and give the soldiers a good lecture. "Believe me, the commander, I am so detached that I do not know where what is done, and the soldiers even more so. In short, we are here as in a dark forest," lamented the captain. "And we are still in the forest and have not left it," laughed Politruk. Soon came the chief of staff. "Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin reported that we will stay here until we receive weapons and ammunition. The regiment and battalion will be replenished with personnel. In the morning the fighters will be provided with hot food, and by 10 the battalion commander is waiting at the regimental headquarters." After that, the commanders unfolded cloaks and wrapped themselves in them with their heads. Already in a minute heard snoring with whistling and overflowing. The battalion scribe, who constantly acted as commandant, approached. He organized the guarding of the headquarters, that is, the sleeping commanders and the sack with the headquarters documentation. What happened next? I do not remember, as sleep fell on me immediately. In the morning I found that I had not even had time to unroll the roll. The clerk came and told me that I could return to my company. I built up the platoon and led it to where ours was stationed. The company was already on its feet. Bogdanov gathered the platoon and squad commanders, showed them where to dig slits for shelter from aircraft, where to build shalashes, as we had no tents. Then the company went to breakfast. With what pleasure we ate hot buckwheat porridge with rare fibres of stew. Each soldier carefully scraped the leftovers out of the kettle, but not everyone got a refill. The last ones who asked for more, the cook took out of the cauldron not with a ladle, but with a big spoon. I was somehow shy to ask the cook for some more. But what I got was a great pleasure. I even relaxed and immediately pulled to sleep. At this time, to the company commander approached a group of sergeants and middle commanders. This was the first replenishment. The newcomers introduced themselves to Bogdanov, giving their surname, rank, and the position they held before. "Murderer Sergeant Yurchenko." I heard a familiar voice and immediately turned to him. Yes, in front of Bogdanov stood the same Yurchenko, who in the regimental school studied in the neighbouring mortar platoon. There he was a squad commander. He almost did not change. The same broad-shouldered, important, slender, except that he had grown older, and a shallow scar appeared on his forehead up to his left eyebrow. His boots were covered with dust. He did not look as dapper as in the regimental school. Then his boots shone better than others, and the cuff of his uniform was white. When we went on leave in Vilnius, the girls always paid attention to him. Then Yurchenko took out the envy and jealousy of other cadets. and for what many disliked him. But in general, he was a good guy and a comrade. Yurchenko reported that his last position was commander of a mortar platoon. That's exactly the commander of mortars and we lack. Rejoiced Bogdanov and said that he will have to take a platoon of 4 company mortars, which we called frogs. He said that Yurchenko paid special attention to the training of newcomers and that his deputy would be Sergeant Avvakumov. Avvakumov, Yurchenko burst out. Yes, Avvakumov. I laughed. Then Yurchenko raked me in his arms and shook me for a long time. Seeing this, Bogdanov rejoiced and said that he was not worried about the mortar. From Yurchenko, I learned that he saw Brodov on the 5th day of the war. He was appointed commander of a rifle platoon, and in a heavy battle, when the company commander died, Brodov took command of the company, took it out of the encirclement, and in one of the battles was seriously wounded. In addition to Yurchenko found another classmate, Sergeant Loboda, who was appointed petty officer of the 3rd Company. Exchanging news, we watched those who introduced themselves to Bogdanov. It was not idle curiosity. We need to know with whom we will have to fight and pull a hard soldier's burden. Staff Sergeant Zubkov, you are appointed commander of the 3rd Rifle Platoon. In the evening, I'll introduce you to the personnel and Sergeant Avvakumov will surrender the platoon to you. No, I'll justify the commander's confidence. He clicked his heels, a short senior sergeant with red hair trimmed to a bob. You must be a serviceman, Yurchenko muttered in my ear. I smiled back, letting him know that I shared his opinion. Having distributed the replenishment, Bogdanov familiarized the commanders with the order on the actions of the company during the deployment of the battalion in the forest and the daily routine of the personnel. Turning to everyone, he asked if there were any questions. Commanders were interested in when the replenishment will arrive, from which units will be replenished with fighters, what weapons will staff the company, how much time is given for training newcomers. The replenishment will arrive no later than August 30. The units will be staffed to full strength. Small arms, several handguns, and 1 machine gun company will receive the same day. Ammunition, before going to the front line. For training is 10 days, said Bogdanov. Not to training. Not enough, sang Junior Lieutenant Smirnov. That's the order, Bogdanov cut off. The first half of the first day of our vacation was clear and warm. A light breeze was blowing through the clearing near which we settled down. We smelled grass and pine. But in the evening the wind increased and brought shaggy clouds. They were thick and dark, clinging to the tops of trees. It smelled of fall. The units accelerated the construction of tents in which they were to shelter from the rain and night autumn cold. On the 2nd day of rest, after breakfast, Yurchenko told me, hurry to the special department of the division. Their senior Lieutenant Beletsky is waiting for you. What did I forget there? I made it clear that you can't play a trick on me. It's not a joke. Beletsky doesn't like it when people don't come to see him. Don't play with fire, the commander persuaded me. I realized that this is not a prank, and asked Yurchenko what Beletsky needs from me. Hey, I was at his place too. It will be about your actions behind the front line. He asked me, for example, how under what circumstances I broke away from my unit, what route I took to get behind the Germans' lines, what I did along the way. In short, who your parents were and who you were before the 17th, explained Yurchenko. What is this? They don't trust me. There, on the heights, Bogdanov trusted to repel attacks, and here he became a stranger. I fled. No, do not boil, do not ignite yourself. Everyone trusts you, but Beletsky has such a service, Yurchenko soothed. I, without answering anything to this, went to the village where the division headquarters and special department was located. It was located in the outermost house. I knocked on the door. A muffled voice answered. Come in. Sergeant Avvakumov arrived at your call, I reported. Senior Lieutenant Beletsky was silent for a minute, scrutinizing me, and then looked at the paper. Sit here closer. He pointed to a large table and a stool that stood against the wall. I pulled the stool over and sat down. Beletsky moved a stack of identical folders to the edge of the table, put a blank sheet of paper in front of him, stood up from the table, and walked around the room a few times, pausing for a long time behind my back. Then he leisurely sat down at the table, took out of his pocket a Pen-Eternal pen and wrote on the blank sheet of paper. Our conversation should be frank and relaxed. I do not intend to keep you here long. Everything depends on how you answer my questions. Now let's get down to business. You, Sergeant, left the rear of the German army separately from the regiment, or rather you lost it or fell behind. What were the reasons or circumstances for this, and in what place and under what conditions did you lose the regiment? Began conversation Beletsky. I have told in detail everything that happened to me up to the Unova station. Well, now tell me with all the details about the way of movement behind the front line. Name the towns, settlements through which you passed, what you did where you were delayed, for what reasons, about the meetings with the Germans in battle, and if there were other meetings, about them too. By the way, there was no encirclement in the area between Jonava and Kaunas. Beletsky said coldly, as if dictating to a pupil, looking at me with fixed eyes. I don't know whether there was or was not a complete encirclement, but at that time the advanced units were already somewhere near Minsk, and Divinsk was captured by the Germans. I answered confusedly. You don't know the situation of those days very well. There are no documents about the breakthrough through the farm, and I think there could not be. Do you know the name of the lieutenant colonel who led the group, and the one who was with him? Beletsky fixed his eyes on me. I know the lieutenant colonel's surname, Gurov, but he is not from our unit. After that, Beletsky did not ask any questions and only shook his head. I never understood what it meant. Either he agreed with me, or it was just his way of talking. The investigator was particularly interested in the battle on the Grada near Idritsa and asked me to tell him about it again. After listening, he said that he did not know these commanders. After hearing about our misadventures in the area of Pustoshek, Beletsky laughed. So you wanted to savour the soup, but you were correctly detained. There were military personnel there, and you also lit a fire. You should have been court-martialed at once. The investigator made a stern face as if he had realized it. We knew nothing about the train. I justified myself. I have the impression that you deliberately fell behind the regiment. Tell the truth, Avvakumov, the truth, and only the truth. Beletsky pretended that he was preparing to write. Yes, don't forget to tell me who supplied you with such a legend. Hey, I have no legend. Everything I say is true. I'm not going to slander myself, I blurted out with resentment, feeling that tears were coming. Beletsky stood up and paced back and forth across the room with his hands behind his back. Only his slow footsteps and the creaking of new belts could be heard in the room. How can you prove that what you say is true? We had a young man like that caught yesterday. He was telling such legends about his exploits in the rear that he was worth a medal. And then it turned out by chance that he was a German spy. That's it. Broke the tense silence, Beletsky. I remembered that I carry my Komsomol ticket with me, although I could get into the hands of the enemy more than once. I took off my right boot. Beletsky was wary and silently, curiously observed what I was doing. After taking off the boot, I tore off the insole and began to tear off the ticket. It was so firmly stuck that I had to take out a penknife. What are you doing? Beletsky couldn't stand it. I answered nothing and continued fiddling with my boot. I pulled off the ticket by force and put it on the table. Here is my last proof that I am telling the truth. There are no others, I almost cried. Beletsky looked at the ticket with curiosity, on which it was still possible to read my surname, name and patronymic. Then he returned the ticket to me. Count Avvakumov. This was said warmly and sympathetically. Then the investigator asked me to tell in detail what I knew about the activities of Combat Kudyakov, about the meeting with the deserters on the lake. So they wanted to defect to the Germans? Beletsky interrogated. I don't think so. The Germans were close by. If they wanted to surrender, they would not have thrown their weapons into the water, and in addition they would have taken us, I reasoned. And why didn't you arrest them? Beletsky asked. There were 6 of them, and 2 of us, and the Germans were nearby. All right, I won't write anything. Goodbye, Sergeant. Go to your company, said the investigator, and taking from the table a sheet of paper, on which was my surname, tore it into shreds and threw it into an old bucket, which was used as a trash can. To the company I walked along an overgrown, long unridden road, where once the wheels of carts had left their mark. The green-grey-coloured poodle caps had sprung up. Suddenly a bird fluttered from behind the bushes. From surprise I instinctively jumped aside and sat down. Apparently, wandering through the German rear had left its mark and developed habits. You'll be afraid of your own shadow, I thought, and then, cursing to myself, went on. In a forest clearing just in front of the company's location, on old stumps sat Bogdanov and Yurchenko. I reported to the company commander that I was in the special department at the call of Senior Lieutenant Beletsky. Bogdanov asked what the conversation was about and said that next time, before going to such calls, I should report to the company commander. Don't be too angry with Beletsky. That's the kind of service he has. He should be a line commander. I saw when we broke out of the encirclement he took command of the battalion instead of the dead major and led the men dashingly into the attack. They made such a corridor that 2 regiments got out of the encirclement. His command presented him to the Red Banner, but we haven't heard anything about the award yet. He's a sensitive, attentive man. He understands things, not like others. We had one special officer, Major Zivagin. This one left his mark. He saw spies and enemy collaborators in everyone. It's good that he was moved somewhere else. When he left, the whole regiment rejoiced. So don't grieve, Bogdanov reassured me. The day began to break, and it was like July. Grasshoppers were silent until then, and as soon as the last cloud in the sky released the sun from its captivity, we heard a friendly chirping. The company commander turned the conversation to something that worried him more. He said that 20 men were expected. He was worried that, according to conversations at the battalion headquarters, many of the newcomers did not hold rifles, and there was nothing to talk about automatic rifles. This is where the problem arose, where to get mortars, who to entrust hand machine guns. We could do without mortars, or take Kuzikov, Mukhametinov and Selivanov from my former platoon. They know a thing or two about mortars. They'll make good gunners. And they will help us to train newcomers. I suggested and pushed Yurchenko's elbow, say support. Yes, these guys should definitely be in the mortar. Yurchenko agreed. Do you even know one of them? Bogdanov stared at Yurchenko with his eyes. Hey, I know I don't know, but I rely on Avvakumov. After all, a classmate, and we are fighting together with him. He embarrassed Yurchenko. I would be happy to give them to you, but where will I get squad leaders? I've been looking at these guys myself for a long time. The lieutenant did not give up. In the end, we managed to defeat Bogdanov. Okay, I'll give you Kuzikov and Mukhametinov. Today I'll tell Zubkov to let the guys go. But don't ask Selivanov. I'll have him to go on reconnaissance and to raise the fighters in the attack. But Bogdanov cut off. He stood up, stretched and wanted to go somewhere. But Yurchenko winked at me slyly, began to process commanders. You have all the cares and worries. But at some point you need to rest. There is a whole war ahead. How about a swim, Comrade Lieutenant? The weather's just right. Maybe it won't be like this again, sang Yurchenko. I supported the senior sergeant. Hey, they've persuaded us. Devils. Bogdanov waved his hand and agreed. Yurchenko led us to the river by a path that was little travelled. It was obvious from his confidence that he had already been to the river more than once. We came out of the forest onto a field road. On both sides of the road there was a wall of bread and closer to the river. In the meadow, women were cutting grass. Seeing us, a young woman, who was walking the first slash, stopped, took off her headscarf and began to wave it. "Comrade commanders, welcome to our brigade. There are enough brides for everyone," she mischievously shouted. Bogdanov stopped and then went to the women. "Well, guys, unbend shoulder, ring side," said the lieutenant. We chose the lithe women from those lying on the knoll. The last scythe was a girl with straw braids. She was all red, exhausted by the unusual work, but using up the last of her strength. She did not want to lag behind her elders. I felt sorry for the little girl, and I told her to rest while I would lead her mowing. The women shouted at her to go into the shade. The company commander took the first slash, forcing the women to regroup. It was obvious that he was not new to peasant work. Bogdanov went in a wide slash, the grass from under his litho wriggling corkscrew. Lenyurchenko's work was worse, but he, pouring sweat, tried to keep up with the commander. In 2 hours we mowed the meadow and then, having gathered a small mow with our hands, sat down for a smoke. The women's brigade settled down near us. During the smoke break we were joking with the women. Their ringleader Masha, the one who first noticed us, was sharp-tongued and laughed the most. Suddenly her eyes became serious and she asked Bogdanov point-blank, "You can work well, but why do you fight badly?" "No. Who told you that badly?" Bogdanov became wary. "If we had fought well, the German would not have gone so far. And now you see we have reached our places, where the German has never been. The front is probably about 70 versts away from here, no more, from Moscow to the British fields. The Red Army is the strongest." She sang mockingly and cried, "Here's the thing, citizen. We are, in fact, not only fighting against the fascists. Hitler directed against us the entire military and industrial potential of Europe. He defeated France in 2 weeks, occupied whole states in a few days, and here we are standing." The lieutenant was boiling. "Don't lecture us, but tell us straight. Will the German come to our village or not?" Already softened, asked the ringleader, wiping away her tears with her kerchief. "Oh, I don't know, and I can't lie. Believe me, we'll do everything we can to delay him and drive him back to his lair," Bogdanov said with his eyes staring at the ground. "I don't blame you, but there's no urine. Look, each of us works for 3 men, and you saw for yourself. The bread has not yet been harvested. The kids are unattended at home. What's there to be unsupervised? There she is, Murka. Look, she should be playing with dolls, but she's mowing with us." Masha pointed to a girl with straw braids. "The war has only just begun, and how many funerals have already come? I haven't received a single letter from my Ivan. Is he alive? Are our children to be orphans?" Masha cried in full voice. Other women were howling at her. We fidgeted, looking for an excuse to get out of here. Sorry, ladies. We have a service waiting for us." Said Bogdanov, looking at his watch. "You'll have to excuse us. Women's tears are cheap. You'd better come to the club in the evening. It's more fun there," Masha said, as if she had realized it. They walked back to the company in silence. The meeting with the women left a heavy impression. Yes, women of the war years, almost all of you are soldiers, and those who saw their husbands off to the front, and those who saw off their loved ones. Yet how much anxiety and suffering took your hearts, and how much labour and hardships have fallen and will continue to fall on your shoulders. For all that your beloved husbands have done before will have to be done by you, and you will have to do twice or even 3 times as much. And how long all this will last, we did not know then. Thinking about women savers, I was transported home to the Urals. And what is it like for my relatives and friends? My father, one can say, is an invalid. My mother, undermined from childhood by hard work. It all comes down to how my brother Vanya will behave. For his sake, the youngest, they are ready to do anything. I don't know yet how it is in the Urals, and the unknown is the worst. The silence was interrupted by Lieutenant Bogdanov. He stopped on the road, turned to the right, and led us behind him. We came to a clearing. "Here, I think, to hold a training of tank fighters," he said. A clearing with a diameter of 100 meters was not a bad place for training tank fighters. At its edge stood 3 piles of stones collected from the clearing, which could become voluminous models of tanks. First we will mow this meadow, dry and gather hay in a stack, and then we will start the training. We are lucky we couldn't think of a better place for this, Bogdanov said, admiring himself. And on the other side of the road, right on the riverbank, is an ideal place for digging. All this I looked at yesterday. Approaching the location of the company, we saw the clerk, platoon commanders, and a group of unfamiliar soldiers. The commander of the 1st platoon, Junior Lieutenant Simkov, hurried towards us. "No. Comrade Lieutenant, we have received a replenishment of fighters," he reported. "They promised tomorrow, but they sent them today." "That's better," said Bogdanov. "There will be more time for their training." The lieutenant lined up the newcomers in 2 rows and asked where they were from. "No. Siberians." "Good. Where and how were you trained?" Addressed the company commander to the right flank guy whose belt was hanging down. "Yes, in the kitchen. He's got a saggy belt." "He's maintaining the household," Selivanov said good-natured. The lieutenant turned around, looked strictly at his favourite, but said nothing and continued to get acquainted with the newcomers. Another Bogdanov would have reprimanded Bogdanov for mocking rookie, but the company commander had a special relationship with the fighter. Those whom the lieutenant led out of the encirclement told how Selivanov helped his commander. It happened like this. The company was breaking through the encirclement. A mine that exploded nearby concussed the lieutenant. He lost consciousness for a while. 2 stout Germans tied Bogdanov and dragged him to their own. Noticing this, Selivanov stealthily crossed the road to the Germans, dragging the lieutenant, and, jumping out unexpectedly, killed both of them with a sapper shovel. Duzhy Selivanov helped Bogdanov to catch up with the company. The lieutenant more than once called Selivanov guardian angel, but with all due respect to the saviour, did not give him down, and often teased at him, remembering how Selivanov shit on the German. This story was well known to the whole company. It was retold in different ways, but the most plausible version I heard from Bogdanov himself, who did not like to add anything and respected accuracy. The lieutenant, with the remnants of his company, was sneaking through the German rear to the front line. They walked mostly through forests and swamps, so as not to meet the Germans. When they came to the road, the soldiers decided to follow it to save their strength and speed up the advance. But having gone a little, they heard a noise from behind. Bogdanov turned the company to the path going into the forest. At the road he left Selivanov and another soldier. Their task was to warn the company with shots if the Germans turned to this path. Selivanov and his partner hid behind a bush in a clearing near the road. On it passed a small unit of Germans. Suddenly the last of the crowd left the ranks and suddenly ran towards the bush, behind which Selivanov and his fighter were hiding. Having thrown down the machine gun, literally tearing off his pants, he sat down. Here Selivanov realized why the German, whom he had already taken at gunpoint, was behaving so strangely, although the bush was quite dense. But the spray and stench got Selivanov, opposite to which the German positioned himself. As soon as the formation disappeared around the corner, Selivanov jumped out from behind the bush, grabbed the German from behind in an armful, covering his mouth and face with his huge palm. Another soldier grabbed the German's automatic rifle. The frightened fascist, with his pants down, was dangling his legs in the air and sprinkled Selivanov with diarrhea several times out of fear. Having caught up with the company, Selivanov forced the German to wash him in a puddle, pooped pants and overalls. This, for the exhausted guys, was a charge of laughter. Bogdanov grudgingly asked why Selivanov had brought the German with him. He only shrugged his shoulders in response. Selivanov signalled the German to go to his own, pointed a carbine at him, saying that if you did not leave, I would kill you. but the German only mumbled in reply, "Nein, nein." He became so attached to Selivanov that he never left him a step. Here comes Selivanov with his Bobik. He had to share his last bread with the German all the way to the rear. As soon as they reached their own, the German was handed over in the first commandant's office. Having got acquainted with the newcomers, Bogdanov distributed them among the units. The rest of the days we spent in intensive training. We had to do a lot of work with the newcomers. Their training and preparation were mediocre, but the desire to fight with the Nazis is great. Instead of 10 days, we were on so-called rest for 8. The battalion was raised on an arm, and we moved on foot to the front. After moving about 5 kilometers away from the station, we heard the explosions of aircraft bombs from its side. At that time, trains with replenishment for other units should arrive. Apparently, the Germans sniffed out our place of rest and formation of shattered units and decided to strike at it. The section of the front to which the battalion was sent was considered quiet. It was located in a low, swampy and wooded area. Our positions ran along the plain, and it was a wide meadow with small hills and islands of bushes. To the left in front grew a small aspen forest, and behind it, on the neutral strip, was a small village Osipovka of a dozen half-destroyed houses. Ahead, about 2 kilometers away, on a small hill stood the village. In front of him passed the German positions. The company commander, having examined the terrain, ordered our platoon to dig a dug-in on a ledge in the neighborhood of the aspen tree and next to it to equip a bunker, connecting it with the trenches. He started digging. At a depth of a little more than a meter, water began to protrude from the ground. We had to make these structures away from the plant, about 100 meters away, on a hill. It was drier here. The dugout turned out well. From the bunker also had a good view and a wide sector of fire. Lieutenant Bogdanov was wary of the aspen forest. This is a future bridgehead to attack our positions. Here the German will accumulate forces if he will be able to attack, said the company commander. He expected that the fire from the bunker would hamper the approach of reserves to the aspen forest from the German side. The lieutenant thought that the mortar platoon's fire could be well corrected from the bunker. The soldiers were dissatisfied with their section. "The water here stinks of swamp," they said. "You can get used to the water. But there are no tanks here, and they are worse than swamp water," laughed back Bogdanov. I heard from the old soldiers of the company, who together with Bogdanov came out of the encirclement, that the lieutenant, when it was necessary to scout something personally, always took Selivanov with him, whom he valued for his bravery, strength, and intelligence. This time he changed his rule. To study the front edge of the German defences, he took me. We crawled through the passages in the minefield to the aspen forest, and from there crawled to the village of Osipovka, examined the outermost house. It was empty. The lieutenant was interested in the best preserved house, which stood higher than the others. We approached it, pressed against the dense fence, listened. Silence. We entered the yard and began to climb the porch. Suddenly something creaked behind us. We instantly crouched down, turned and pointed our automatic rifles in the direction of the sound. It was a board overhanging from the roof that squeaked. Bogdanov muttered in a whisper, and we began to make our way to the attic. Here he took out a map of the terrain and began to observe the German defences, making his notes. I was told to observe the first line of defence and identify firing points. The German trenches were deserted, as if everyone there had died out. I stared until my eyes burned, but I didn't see anything worth noticing. Only an hour and a half later I saw 2 helmets floating along the message line towards a small hillock. About 5 minutes later, a pair of helmets floated by again, only in the opposite direction. I informed Bogdanov about everything I saw. He asked me to show him where, and he looked through binoculars for a long time. "This hillock is a camouflaged bunker, and the helmets you're talking about are the duty shift or patrols. Do you see a hole to the right?" Bogdanov asked. "I see why. Your mortar, notice all the hiding places and unevenness, where the Germans can hide if they will attack our positions. To cover them there for sure, and not to sow mines all over the field. We have plenty of them. The lieutenant instructed me. Here I realized why Bogdanov had taken me instead of Selivanov this time. After sitting in the attic for 3 hours, we returned to the company by the same way we had sneaked into the village. For 3 days neither we nor the enemy were active. The Germans methodically shelled our rear and the mined area. Lieutenant Bogdanov only frowned when shells lay near the aspen tree. He grumbled. The bastard has found out where we have mined areas and shoots there. On the 4th day, at night, flares flew in our direction. Bogdanov ran to our dugout and began to watch the illuminated space. One of the rockets hung closer to the aspen tree. The lieutenant saw 2 Germans crawling along a passage in the minefield. Yurchenko noticed 2 more, crawling along another passageway. Look, bastards, like at home. They go around, they know everything here. Bogdanov scolded, taking the telephone receiver in his hands. He ordered the machine gunners from the 1st platoon to move the guests. Already over the aspen tree hovered our rockets. Bogdanov gave a line on the nearby Germans. Then fighters from the 1st platoon gave several bursts from Stankacha. The company commander ordered me to fire a few mines at the hole he had noticed when we were in Osipovka. It can't be that they crawled without support. When I returned, Bogdanov praised. Well done, mortarmen. Exactly in the hole mines lay down. He clapped me on the shoulder. Did you see it? After all, it was night. Even if you poke your eyes out, I was perplexed. We didn't see, but we heard a scream from there. Naft Komrati. We've been here for almost a week, and the Germans are not showing any activity. Not a single enemy airplane flew over our positions. What would that mean? Commissar Sedik, who visited our dugout, explained it all like this. Our troops, during the withdrawal, exhausted the enemy, grinded up a lot of his equipment and manpower. During this time, we learned to fight better and managed to knock the enemy's self-confidence. If the Germans had enough forces, they would sit and wait for us to go on the offensive. They have only a few reserves to somehow provide the main directions of strikes. If we used to retreat, now we are holding back the enemy and even preparing to attack, they said Sedi. And here came the deadline for our active actions. Returning from the battalion headquarters, Lieutenant Bogdanov went around all the platoons. At us, he stayed with half an hour. Tomorrow morning we must break through the German defences and liberate the village, told us the lieutenant. The main fire support of the company was assigned to our platoon. The 2nd company was to advance in the middle. The 1st and 3rd companies from the flanks. Since the evening we checked the mortars, filled the trays with mines and once again discussed the fulfillment of their tasks. I was entrusted with correcting the fire. At 10 o'clock all but the sentries went to bed. In the morning Yurchenko pushed the soldiers. The platoon silently, carrying mortars and taking trays, crossed the aspen forest and on the outskirts of Osipovka took up firing positions. Rifle platoons went to the initial lines. It was getting light, and the company went on the offensive, silently past half of the meadow, and suddenly from the German side hit machine guns. The fire was so strong that the company had to lie down. Our platoon responded with fire from their small guns. We hit the firing points, they were pretty accurate. The machine guns of the 2 bunkers were quickly suppressed. Although the mines accurately lay on the Bezots, but they did not have enough force to destroy the overlaps and knolls. 3 Bezots in the path of the company still snapped machine gun fire. Bogdanov sent 3 groups of 3 men to suppress these firing points. They must get close to the bunkers and throw grenades at them. 2 fire points were suppressed at once. To the 3rd had to send another group, because the 1st group was killed by machine gunners. The 2nd group suppressed the bunker, and Bogdanov led the company in a rapid attack. The soldiers jumped into the trenches, where a brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued. They fought with bayonets, small sapper spades and knives. Bogdanov wanted on the shoulders of the retreating to break into the trenches of the 2nd line of defence, but could not stop the excitement of the battle that unfolded in the trenches of the 1st line. He was running, shouting, swearing. Finally, people listened to him. Each platoon left to finish the enemy on the department, and the rest went to attack the second line of defense, but were met with such machine gun fire that had to lie down and crawl back to the trenches of the first line. Here the company was hit by enemy artillery fire. Waiting it out, the men pulled their heads into their collars, then shook off clods of earth, which painfully and abundantly fell on them after each shell burst. Bogdanov 3 times raised the company in the attack, but the Germans 3 times drove us back. At the company's position crawled Battalion Chief of Staff Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin. "Bogdanov, why are you delaying the capture of the second line of defense? You're disrupting the fulfillment of the combat mission. The captain will court-martial you," he shouted at Bogdanov. "I'll tell you what, get out of here with your court-martial. I don't intend to ruin the company for nothing. Get out of here." Bogdanov attacked the senior lieutenant. He backed away and disappeared imperceptibly, just as he had appeared. The lieutenant waved to me, letting me know to follow him, and we ducked and ran to the positions of the mortar. "Yurchenko, why are your mortars silent?" Close to the senior sergeant, shouted Bogdanov. "We are afraid to cover our own. You are close by," justified the mortar commander. "Here's what. Now pull the connection to the first line of German defences. A Varkamov from there will correct the fire. Hit thicker volleys." "Got it." Bogdanov glittered his eyes. "And if somehow on their own?" Yurchenko asked timidly. "1 or 2 mines we will tolerate. Do what I said," shouted, leaving Bogdanov. I followed him, and behind us the communicator uncoiled a telephone wire. The first shooting mines did not hit us. Then salvos were given, and then a quick fire on the German defences. Those small mines company mortars, but they did their job. Rising to the attack, the company met a weak fire and broke into the second line of trenches. The Germans who survived rushed away, hiding in houses and yards. From there they had to smoke them out with grenades, so step by step the company reached almost to the opposite end of the village. But then came the enemy reserves. Germans, who arrived on several cars, jumped out of the bodies, lay down in the ditch of the road and opened hurricane fire on the company. We had to retreat into the trenches of the second line and repel the attacks of the German reserve. Captain Dementiev appeared in the company. He ordered to retreat to his defence. Lieutenant Bogdanov was surprised to spread his hands, his eyes glazed. How so? The village is almost captured, so many people laid down. But the captain said that this is an order from the regiment. The company may remain cut off from the main forces. The task of the mortar platoon now was to cut off the Germans from the attacking Germans' combat guard, under the cover of which the company withdrew. Therefore, we remained in our previous positions near the aspen forest and the village. His task mortar fulfilled. We began to gather, as Kuzikov shouted. "Guys, we are surrounded." Indeed, a group of machine gunners of about 10 men lay down opposite the passage through the minefield. We had 3 mines left. Yurchenko himself aimed and fired them at the Germans. They rushed into the aspen forest, leaving 3 corpses at the passage. But at that time, from the side of Osipovka, another group of the enemy came at us. Yurchenko commanded that we took the defence in an open place, on a hill, closer to the observation point of the company of our defence. From the command post we'll see our position and provide assistance. We had to shoot for a long time from the Germans who were attacking from 2 sides. Especially dangerous acted from the side of the first line of German defence another, more numerous group. But whether ours did not see, although they were 400 metres away from us or something else. But for half an hour we had to shoot off the enemy alone. Probably having guessed that we were running out of ammunition and had no mines at all, the Germans attacked the platoon more brazenly and persistently. Grenades came into play, and at that time from the side of our defence 2 Stankicher hit the Germans, and then from the command post the platoon of Junior Lieutenant Semenov rushed to the Germans. The Germans hastily retreated without even taking wounded men. We picked up 2 of them and handed them over to the battalion headquarters. Having breathed after the trouble, the platoon was preparing to rest. At this time came a messenger from the company with the order of Captain Dementiev, all company commanders, platoon commanders and their assistants to go immediately to the battalion headquarters. Here was held a review of the unsuccessful offensive on the village. Captain Dementiev was as irritated as ever. The reason is that during the offensive, the 3rd Company could not break through the defences in their own section, and the 1st Company, capturing the front line of the German defence, further did not move a step. In the battle, the company commander was killed. His replacement, Lieutenant Verevkin, who, having left the school, participated for the first time in the battle, had no experience and was confused. Neighbouring battalions involved in the offensive suffered heavy losses and retreated to the original lines. This explained the reason for the withdrawal of our company. Lieutenant Bogdanov listened to all this, frowning. His left arm was bandaged and hung on a bandage. He had been wounded twice while leading the company away. Captain Dementiev praised the actions of our company, but Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin threw a retort. He is good. He has a mortar platoon. And the other companies had more machine guns. This does not count. Bogdanov snapped at him. It was felt that the Chief of Staff and the commander of our company relations strained. This apparently knew and the commander so immediately hurried to cut off the squabble. What is the conclusion? Said Dementiev, and after a long pause, explained that many commanders and most of the soldiers entered the battle unfired, with poor training. He gave the example of how the men of the 1st Company, instead of rushing to get out from under artillery fire, lay down level ground they should have dug in, but they just lay there. The captain cited data that made everyone think. Of the new additions were killed and wounded in this offensive more than 1/3 of the battalion. Of the old guys who had been in the encirclement, killed and wounded in battle only 5%. The captain demanded that each commander to make a plan for training fighters to master weapons and the ability to act in the offensive and defense. He said that all spare time should be devoted to training the personnel, supervision entrusted to Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin. But learning in combat conditions is not easy. The front line is not a field in the rear where you can practically consolidate the theory. We tried to do our best to pass on our experience to the new. The training took the form of mentoring. Time allowed experienced fighters to work with the sponsored, the more so that the enemy on our side did not show much activity, and we, taking into account their failures and blunders, did not sleep. At night we mined the passages in the minefield detected by the enemy, taking advantage of the darkness, made other passages. For patrolling and on duty we sent newcomers with experienced fighters. On a quiet area we stood for several weeks. One morning an unfamiliar lieutenant accompanied by the Chief of Staff came to our dugout. There is a mortar. He informed the unfamiliar Lieutenant Ryabinin through the embrasure, familiarized the lieutenant with the surrounding terrain, showed the most vulnerable places in our defense. The lieutenant turned out to be a talkative man. He asked how we lived, told us that their battalion had come to replace us. About 40 kilometers from the front line, there is a village where we have 2 weeks to rest and staffing. From him we learned the latest news about affairs at the fronts. Having received the command, we quickly packed up and left the already well-furnished dugout. We had to get to the place of rest on foot. It was fall, the sky was frowning, and the air was cold. It felt that from day to day we had to wait for real frost. The voice of the company commander outside the barn door woke me up. Bogdanov was saying something to the sentry, but it was difficult to make out, as the lieutenant spoke in a low voice. After a minute the sentry announced, "Wake up." Yushchenko grumbled unhappily at the company commander. He himself does not sleep and does not let others, and went down from the hay on the frozen floor of the barn. I followed him and then the rest of the mortar platoon. At once I felt the cold draught from the wind outside coming through the slits of the barn, walking freely on the floor. Shaking off the hay, we stomped to the door. Benches, prepare for formation. Yushchenko commanded and kicked open the barn door. "Brothers, it's winter," shouted the fighter Istomin, and was the first to jump out of the barn. He ran to a snowdrift that had accumulated overnight, scooped up a palmful of fluffy snow and began to wash his face with it. Dirty water dripped from his flushed face. Then Istomin took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. Rovin, a staid Siberian of about 35, looked at Istomin judgmentally. You found something to be happy about, you fool. Winter, if you freeze in the trenches, you'll sing different. You'll remember the warm summer, grumbled Rovin. He took his time rubbing his hands with snow when the mud stopped dripping from them, wiped them diligently with the overcoat, and only then began to look at his face. Having built up the platoon, Yurchenko reported to the company commander, who stood there and watched the men wash up. Bogdanov was wearing a new white dungaree, which sat nicely on his shoulders and made our commander younger and more youthful. He gave the command at ease and familiarized us with the daily routine. It was suggested to shave and get ready for the bath. After bathing to wait for the command, it is possible that the battalion will not stay here for a long time. Mortar men not to go far from the barn. Here you are, grandmother and jury's day, muttered under his nose Istomin. Bogdanov, standing 3 steps away from him, heard it, looked at Istomin sternly, but without saying anything, went to another unit. The announcement that there was a bath to be washed in the bathhouse caused lively conversations. Rovin, the eldest of us, was relishing the story of how he had had to steam almost to the point of fainting in his homeland in Siberia. I memorized his story almost verbatim. It used to happen that on Saturday you would heat up the bathhouse in our vegetable garden and go with your wife to steam. And she was very fond of my birch broom. If you pour a shake or two on the stove, you'll get so steamed up that you won't be able to see yourself. You'd think the steam would raise the roof or blow up the whole place. You steam the broom and roast her back and arse with it. You're exhausted, the zone screams and screams. You swear, drop the broom and she's on you. If you get on all fours, the woman will whip you with the broom so hard that your whole body burns with fire. It feels as if at that moment you'd give your soul to God. Then you rush out into the garden. It's a good thing I always remembered where the door was. Otherwise I'd have knocked out the wall. You roll around in the snow and go back under the broom. That's how we used to do it 3 times a day. And at the end, as they say, we'd pour a couple of kvass kettles into the broom for dessert. The broom gets hot there, and we take turns spanking each other. Then we'd get cold water and go home barefoot. And, as is customary in a good home, every time I bought half a litre for the bath and put it on the table. My grandmother didn't refuse vodka. She'd drink half a glass and sit there like a red beet, just laughing. Yes, it's a royal thing to steam. After a good broom, it's like being born again. It's easy on the soul, pleasant warmth runs through the body, and you sleep like you do afterwards. You, Rovin, are probably referring to the brooms hanging in the barn. You interrupted Yurchenko. I allow you to take 2 pairs. Enough for the platoon, not 1 more. Or the owner will come and think badly of us. He'll say we're not Red Army soldiers but looters. Having made a meaningful pause, Yurchenko turned to everyone. Understand? Confirming that they understood, the mortars began to ask Yurchenko whether they would issue winter clothes. What about underwear? Would they issue new ones, or would they leave the old ones after frying? You will find out everything on the spot. Yurchenko made it clear that he himself does not really know how washing in the bathhouse will be organized. We've all gotten quite lousy lately. These damned insects literally ate us up, not giving rest neither day nor night. No matter how we tried to get rid of the lice, we undressed up to our waists, turned our underwear inside out over the fire or in front of the stove, shook them over the fire. We saw how the insects could not stand the heat and fell into the fire. But alas, even this method did not help to get rid of lice. Lately we often noticed each other's lice crawling even on the collars of overcoats. I'd give a lot to get rid of those things. Rovin sighed, pressing a louse that had just come out of his sinus with his fingernails. How many do you have in stock? Istomin asked, eliciting laughter from the others. But Rovin, as if not noticing, reasoned. All this is from dirt impurity. And it's not true. It's not dirt. It is from longing, grief, and cares. Nikitic, the rider, intervened in the conversation. This frail old man of indeterminate years was permanently assigned to our platoon, although he was in the squad, and at first he drove the kitchen, but for some reason the cook demanded that they give another rider for that. Probably because Nikitic was unlucky, like Grandfather Shukar and terribly chatty, always got into all conversations, and the cook was a silent man. I guess they didn't see eye to eye. A louse is just like a rat. It makes itself known when there's hardship. Dirt, you say? Not like that. Before the war I had to live in mud, but I never saw lice. And not because there were no lice. There's a louse in every man. In good times it lives inside him, and in bad times it climbs out and gnaws on him. If he dies, it will go with him, or it will move to another man. You're talking nonsense. Yurchiko cut him off. Not nonsense. You live with me, you will see everything. You will not talk like that. Nikitic took offence, and then, getting hot, continued. In our village a priestess died, and the father loved her as a dove loves a dove. He became sad after that, became lousy. Sometimes he was conducting the service, but now and then he went behind his sinus and itched fiercely. Then he passed away. When he was lying in his coffin, I saw lice coming out of his skin. Yurchenko spat squeamishly and left, so as not to hear the old man. Soon he returned and gave the command to form up. The bathhouse was located on the bank of a still unfrozen rivulet. A large tent was stretched between the bushes. Nearby, on rails, 2 metal gasoline barrels filled with water stood over the holes. The top of the barrels had been cut out with an autogen. There were fires burning under the barrels. 20 meters away stood 2 camp kitchens. Water was also heating in their cauldrons. 100 paces from the tent stood 2 roasting tents, which we called showers. The company foreman and the head of the regimental sanitary unit, Junior Lieutenant Yamanayev, whom we called not by rank and position, but simply Doctor, supervised the washing. The small, puny commander in a long overcoat, not to his height, with tangled in the legs, looked more like a monk than a warrior. He was always fussing, confusing everything. And if it had not been for the foreman, a staid and judicious man with a booming voice, the washing would hardly have taken place under Yamanayev's leadership. Yurchenko reported to the petty officer that the mortar platoon had arrived for the wash. The petty officer took a stern look at the formation and set the task. Undress here. Pointed his finger at the place cleared of snow. Empty your pockets, take off your waist and pants belts, take your documents and everything else with you. Everything taken off will go to roast. Use water sparingly, 5 cauldrons per person. You will dress there, in new clothes. The foreman pointed to another area where there were mountains of new underwear, uniforms, overcoats and boots. 2 captains and a few men from the platoon were working there. You won't need this. After washing, put it back where you found it, said the petty officer sternly, glancing coldly at Rovin, who had 2 pairs of brooms slung over his shoulder. This remark caused an explosion of laughter in the platoon. No. So start washing. I give 20 minutes per platoon, said the petty officer nonchalantly, looking at his watch. Yes, the brooms were not really needed. And 20 minutes for washing turned out to be a lot. There was a thick white mist in the tent. Large drops of condensation were falling from above, scalding cold, and a draught stung my feet below. It was good that someone had thought of throwing straw on the ground. The heated ground turned to mud, and only straw somehow still saved from it. The platoon washed ahead of schedule in about 10 minutes. But no one had fully utilized the norm, 5 cauldrons. Slightly soaked up and washed off the foam, the soldiers rushed out of the tent. Without trying on, they snatched the underwear from the hands of the captains and pulled it on themselves. The washing was spoiled by the fact that in one barrel there was slightly warm water, and in the other boiling water. Rovin hastily scooped a cauldron from the barrel of boiling water and scalded his leg. He howled and then broke into such a shouting match that even the imperturbable petty officer interrupted the briefing of another unit arriving for a wash, looked into the tent and shouted angrily. Stop the mat. There was a hitch with the uniforms as well. It was the first time that most of us had encountered windbreakers. The prudent petty officer assigned the duties of a winding instructor to the captain's midshipman, who pedantically showed us in which hand to take the winding and how to wind it. In spite of the instruction, most of them did not succeed at once. Some windings jumped out of their hands and rolled on the ground, others wound unevenly. A petty officer came up and condescended to look at how we were fiddling with windings. Finish dressing. You will work out the operation with windings at your location. And now clear the dressing ground for the next unit, he addressed Yurchenko with unperturbed calmness. Leaving the dressing ground, the platoon gathered by the river, and the men looked at each other. Body coats under overcoats made us look thicker, and our legs in windbreakers looked thinner. Everyone looked unfamiliar and comical. All the way to the barn the platoon laughed at Rovin, who, limping slightly, carried back his brooms. Battalions. Battle alarm? Company and platoon commands sounded. Our battalion left the village. We didn't know where we were going. On the frozen road the units moved quickly. On the march there were short breaks and smoke breaks. Nobody knew what was the reason for the incomprehensible haste. Rockets were constantly rising in the air. In the sky we could hear the rumble of passing airplanes and the constant howling of a German reconnaissance plane. On the left side we could see the flames of fires, so we were walking along the front line. Early in the morning the battalion halted in a birch grove on the bank of a dry swamp. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Bogdanov conducted a small exercise with the company. They practiced offensive tactics. In the evening, in a small clearing, Commander gathered all the personnel of the company. With him were Political Officer Sitnikov and Petty Officer. In front of them lay several parcel boxes of different sizes. Senior Political Officer announced that the workers of the Ivanovo region sent gifts for the soldiers of the Red Army. Part of the gifts came to our company. He read out a letter in which the Ivanovo workers called to mercilessly smash the fascists and swore to do everything to provide the front with everything necessary. Then began the distribution of gifts, handkerchiefs, tobacco pouches, homemade cigarette cases and other items. But everything was made with love. With each gift there was a letter to a strange warrior. Photos were attached to some letters. The letters were written warmly. The girls shared their successes in labour and offered to correspond. I received a kit set from a girl from Kirzak from a silk weaving factory. Here we also received an explanation of why we left the village so suddenly. It turned out that the Germans learned about the concentration of units in it and showed special attention to the village. This was transmitted by radio from the German side by our scouts. The correctness of the message was soon confirmed. German bombers tried to make a raid on the village, but they were driven back by our fighters. The senior political officer reported that we had a serious task before us. In the area where we are following, we have to move to an active defense. Now the enemy is pulling together forces in the Moscow direction. We have to constantly keep the enemy in suspense, not to give him the opportunity to remove reserves from his section. Now, he said, everything is crucial, and there are no secondary areas of the front. It all ended with the fact that the senior political officer brought us an apology from the Concert Brigade, which due to the situation was redirected to other units. This time we had to spend the night right in the forest. We were not allowed to light fires. Not far from the birch forest there was a spruce forest. Each of us brought 2 or 3 piles of pine branches from there. The platoon shoveled the snow, laid the branches, and we huddled together and went to sleep. That's when we realized how handy were our coats and cotton pants. What would we do now in just overcoats? In the morning of October 19, the battalion left the forest and moved in a southwestern direction. The weather was the most hiking weather. The snow had melted, a warm breeze dried the ground and the road. It was easy and even pleasant to walk on the road not yet broken by cars and wagons. The only thing that annoyed everyone was the windings. They often unravelled on the move due to unskillful winding. The rear men stepped on them. and conflicts arose on this ground. Stamin received a slap from Rovin for stepping on the winding, and Rovin almost fell down. By the middle of the day, when the sun warmed up and the pace increased, many people began to regret that they had been dressed in coats and cotton pants. Toward evening we made a small break. Field kitchens with cooks we didn't know appeared from somewhere and fed us with dinner. Everyone had the impression that we were looping, but Lieutenant Bogdanov himself could not understand anything about the direction of our movement, and, when we asked him, only shrugged his shoulders. By evening the column stopped in an old pine tree. We were announced that here we would wait for the cars that would take us to the front. It was already dark. We sat by the road and smoked cigars. Suddenly we heard a humming sound unaccustomed to our ears. To the left of us, to the front line, we saw, like flashes, some flickers generally making an arc. Then from the side of the enemy came a continuous rumble of bursts. We stood up and wondered. What is it? Polytruk Sitnikov explained that it was singing Katyusha, our guards' mortars. He said nothing new about them. We had heard a lot about the power and strength of these weapons, but it was the first time we saw how they worked. Sitnikov said that now in our rear is being set up production of new weapons. He said that some places already have 57mm anti-tank guns, which take any German armour at a great distance. That many units are equipped with anti-tank guns, that the production of anti-tank grenades has already begun, which are stronger and more convenient than the bundles with which we went to the tanks. He was ready to tell us more about different novelties, but at that time we noticed the headlights of cars looping along the road. We heard the voice of Captain Dementiev. "Battalion, come out to form up on the road." In the darkness the captain could not be seen, but everyone heard his voice. "There are not enough cars. Sit down tightly." Commanders built their companies and platoons and distributed them to the cars. The column started. We travelled no more than 30 kilometres. The battalion left the cars and moved on foot in the direction of none of us did not know Belogo. Nobody knew whether it was a forest, a village, or something else. We marched at a forced march, as there was an order to take the defence before dawn. Our platoon followed the first rifle platoon. It was dark all around, even if you could poke your eyes out. I felt tired and incredibly sleepy. At times I managed to fall asleep on the move, even sleepy to adjust to the pace at which the column was going on different parts of the way. But at the same time, 3 times I ran into the leader of the first platoon, who, having lost patience, threatened to hit me with a rifle butt. After that, the sleep somehow disappeared, and I was going normally. Toward morning, I heard the voice of the company commander. He was now walking next to the formation and kept pushing the pace. Wider step. Don't stretch. By his behaviour, we could understand that we were late for this white ball. The farther we went, the clearer we heard the gun and machine gun fire, and ahead of us rockets flew into the sky more and more densely. The forest became thinner, and more often we met clear glades or fields. A talend was passed down the Cheng. Battalion halt. Judging by the shadows, the first company went to the right, and the third, overtaking us at an angle, went to the left. In a couple of minutes we went straight ahead. We were walking through small woods, which descended to the bare plain. We met scattered groups of fighters, among whom there were only junior commanders. People were in a hurry to leave these places, but there was... "Where are you in a hurry?" I asked the machine gunner who was draining water from the casing. He did not answer anything. On the other hand, the second number of the squad, laden with empty ribbon boxes, was more talkative. "If you go on the offensive to the village a couple of times and lie in a clear field under enemy fire, then you'll understand why we're in a hurry to get out of here." "Where are you from? From the rear or from the neighbouring area?" asked the fighter. From the neighbouring one." "No," I answered him after him. "And we are coming from the very border. But we've been delayed here," the soldier turned around and shouted. The companies, which left the defence early, caused confusion in the ranks of Captain Dementiev's battalion. Many of the commanders and fighters thought that this is a retreat of our units, descending into the valley. We lost sight of the outline of the village, which was visible when we were still coming out of the small woods. In front of us was the embankment of the drainage ditch, hiding the village. The platoon reached the ditch and lay down behind it, watching the terrain that lay between the ditch and the village. Between us and the village, situated on the high bank of the river, was a low plain. It was impossible to discern in the pre-morning twilight the positions we should take, for there was a thick fog over the river and nearby. "It seems that the Germans missed our withdrawal," said Bogdanov, looking into the valley and the village. He ordered each platoon to send forward a reconnaissance and as soon as possible to take the abandoned dugouts and trenches by stealthy ways. Our platoon reached the forward trenches safely. Nearby we found a spacious but cluttered dugout. Yurchenko illuminated it with a flashlight. There was nothing here. There were old bloody bandages, scraps of various papers, cartridge cases, a rusty battered kettle, stomped boots and other Having oriented himself in the situation, Yurchenko put out in dangerous places 2 calculations with handheld lulimets and a combat guard. With dawn the platoon began to master their positions. We were worried about where to place the mortar crews. Everything around was bare, not a bush, not a hillock, not a gully. If there were any, the enemy would have detected it all long ago and shot at it. Apparently he was not very active here. That's the conclusion we all came to. Otherwise, how can one send a battalion already shattered and not replenished with men to a serious area? At the same time, the condition of the battalion in no way corresponded to the task that Sitnikov was talking about, adaptive defense. Here, as if on the palm of the hand, a position extremely disadvantageous for both defense and offensive. The first day at the new site passed quietly. The personnel devoted it to the arrangement of the dugout and positions, and I, with Yurchenko, was engaged in the study of my defense and the position of the enemy. But without good reconnaissance, it was difficult to know how the German fortified in the village, where and what his firing points. Our predecessors left us nothing. Unless the battalion commander has something, he had meetings with company commanders almost all day long, and on the first day Bogdanov did not even visit the platoon. In the evening a messenger from the company brought the mail. This time I had to dance too. I immediately sat down to read the long-awaited message. In the evening in the dugout mortar came Bogdanov and Sitnikov. Having examined how we had settled down, they talked to the soldiers about this and that. Yurchenko and I were wary. Komroty and political officer will not come for nothing. We were waiting for a serious conversation. Sitting at the table next to a smoker made from a shell casing, Sitnikov began to talk about the fact that in our area is solved the task to restrain the reserves of the German army, which can be transferred to Moscow and other directions. Why does not the German is not active against us? From those positions which the battalion occupies, the enemy has nothing to do to throw us off. But he doesn't do it. Why? Because he's in an advantageous position. The village can be held with a small force. The German High Command is scrambling to reinforce the main lines. According to the regimental intelligence, from the neighbouring site removed up to a battalion of infantry which is sent to Moscow. An artillery battery has withdrawn from our section in a direction not yet known. The battalion's business is to restrain the enemy's troops here and make him ask for reserves instead of giving them up. And this can be done only by active, offensive actions. For example, the Germans will try to do everything not to lose White Boar. If they are threatened by this, they will not remove a single soldier from here, said Sitnikov. After him, Bogdanov entered the conversation. He talked about specific things. Tomorrow the offensive on Bely Bor should begin, but there is no accurate data on the enemy's defences. Therefore, the offensive will begin with combat reconnaissance. Bogdanov outlined a plan of action reconnaissance, in which a big role was assigned to mortars. I decided to write a letter to my family before going to sleep. At the table sat Gunner Kopylov. Lately he was lost, taciturn, constantly writing letters. When I sat down to the table, there was a stack of triangles in front of Kopylov. "Where are you taking so many of them?" I asked. I have to write to everyone that I'm still alive, he said sadly. I realized that something was wrong with the guy. Maybe a bad feeling. I thought to myself, usually before they die, people become different, withdrawn. I had observed that more than once recently. Thinking about Kopylov, I remembered what I had dreamed after the bathhouse. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy. Could something happen to me too? I tried to push this anxiety away, to think about other things, but nothing worked. As I have a premonition, I was worried. But gradually I managed to drive away this unusual for me attack of anxious sadness. Having written the letter and folded it into a triangle, I lay down on the bunk, but I could not sleep. I began to think about what Sirikov had said. Yes, time had done its work. If in the first days and months of the war we were just fleeing from the Germans, now the situation is more stable. We are now not running from the enemy, not knowing his forces and directions of movement. We already control the situation, we begin to force him to act as we wish. We have retreated far, but now we are not rolling backwards as before. In previous battles, and tomorrow we will fight to repel the occupied by the enemy. I have not yet had to go on the attack supported by tanks. I have not yet seen the crushing blows on the enemy of our aviation, but I myself have experienced what it is. If we had that weapon, which told Sitnikov recently, it would be hard on the enemy, I reasoned to myself and fell asleep. Early in the morning we were awakened by Bogdanov. He came to the dugout accompanied by a group of soldiers, among whom was Selivanov. Bogdanov turned to Yushchenko. Get ready, guys. 2 of your calculations will go on reconnaissance. Evakumov I will take away from you for a while. He will lead the combat actions of mortars in the reconnaissance, and then perhaps he will take the rifle platoon. We're smoking a cigarette. Bogdanov walked back and forth. He was not wearing a new white coat, but an old overcoat with shortened flaps. Why are you so dressed up, Comrade Lieutenant? Perplexed, asked Yushchenko. Winter is coming soon, so I'm like a gypsy. I sold my fur coat. Today it will be hot so that it was easier to scramble, so I wore this, Mercy Bogdanov joked. Coming out of the dugout, we crawled forward 100 meters and, taking cover behind a small hillock, began to observe the village. On the ground lay thick hoarfrost which melted under us. It was still dark, but the silhouettes of the houses in Belibor were clearly outlined. On the left, where the river skirts the village, there was a small patch of willow trees. Before dawn, 2 by 2 sneaked to this willow tree. Set mortars there and wait for the red rocket signal. After that, open fire on the edge of the cliff and lay mines in front of the stone house, which goes straight to the shore. Bogdanov told we safely reached this position, set mortars and waited for the signal. Observing the neutral strip, we saw how Selivanov's squad crawled up to the river, waded across it and disappeared under the cliff. When it got a little warmer, a red rocket flew up into the sky. We opened fire. The first mines lay to the right of the house. The Germans returned fire from the basement windows of the stone house. They fired at random, watering the neutral strip. The next mines landed opposite the house. 1 machine gun fell silent, the other kept firing. We moved our fire to the edge of the cliff to the left of the house. We fired a dozen mines there. Suddenly machine guns started firing from somewhere to the left. We stopped firing and pressed ourselves to the ground. In a minute the machine guns were silent. I raised my head and saw 100 meters away people crawling towards us. There was no doubt that they were Germans. We hit them with a hand machine gun. They froze and began to crawl away. The machine guns on the left again went in bursts through the willow trees, cutting branches. Our position was becoming critical, but at that time 2 green rockets soared into the sky and the companies went on the offensive. The machine guns transferred the fire to Lieutenant Mishin's company, which was advancing on the village to our left. We tensely watched the actions of our company. On the frost-covered plain, we could clearly see how the soldiers were silently running towards the village. The German machine guns started talking. They were firing from the cellar of the house, which was closest to the cliff on the bank, and apparently from camouflaged dugouts to the left of the house. The company advanced about 150 meters, lay down and began to entrench. At that time there was a strong explosion and silence of the machine gun, which was beating from the basement of the house. We guessed that it was the work of the fighters of Selivanov's department. Some of them had fired a bunch of grenades at the window. In a minute or two the house was already in flames. We had an opportunity to continue firing. Fugitive hit the edge of the cliff where, as it was assumed, passed the first line of enemy defense and hit the machine gun points, but the fire had no effect. The machine guns of the Germans still continued to keep the company pinned to the ground. After a while another explosion of the same kind was heard and another machine gun was silenced. But on the company sprinkled mines. There followed a dash of the company out of the fire. The soldiers reached the cliff, where they became out of reach of the machine guns. We intensified the treatment of the bank with mines in front of the company, but the ammunition was running out. Mishin's company was stopped by heavy machine gun fire. That machine gun, which had alarmed us before the advance of the company, again engaged us. "Remember dogs." "Gone gnashing his teeth," said Gunner Isterman. Looking closely, we found that the enemy machine gunner was firing from behind a bush, some 200 paces away from us. Kurzikov sent one mine there, and the machine gun was permanently frozen. "What a piece of jewelry," admired Isterman. "Why can't you suppress the machine guns on the shore with such skill?" "Maybe they are beating from the bunkers, and our little ones don't destroy good cover," Kurzikov justified himself. Having used up the last mines, we did not act. We had a hand machine gun, enough discs, but there were no targets. It was useless to bombard the coast in front of our company, it is far away, and to hit the machine guns that stopped Mishin's company. We could not. They were closed from us by plantings of poplars, where the river wraps around the village from the south. We were not disturbed by the Germans, who at first tried to crawl up to our position. They were distracted by the advance of the Third Company, which was more dangerous than we were. We wanted to move back to the firing positions of the platoon, but at that time the enemy transferred mortar fire behind the cliff in the expectation to damage our company. Mines began to burst in the river and then closer to the cliff. We realized that someone at the Germans clearly corrects the fire. But at that time a Hera came. Lieutenant Bogdanov, in order not to ruin the company for nothing under the cliff, led it in a blind attack on the village. It was so lightning fast that in a minute the company was in the trenches of the first line of defense and engaged in hand-to-hand combat there. At that time our mortars stopped firing and silenced the German mortars for fear of covering their own. I commanded the men to rush to Yurchenko's position. We had no other, more convenient moment to get out of the willow tree shaved by machine guns. Somewhere halfway along the road, Kopylov, who was running in front of me, stumbled and fell down. I wanted to help him up, but his face was lifeless. It is not known from where a stray bullet hit him. Kurzikov and Isterman took him under their arms and dragged him away. When we dragged Kopylov into the trench, he was still breathing. He died a few minutes later during bandaging. I somehow calmly perceived Kopylov's death, maybe because his premonitions and strange behavior the day before had prepared me for it. But another thing began to disturb me. A dream I had recently had while visiting the petty officer. Could something like that befall me too? I thought, and my heart was pounding anxiously and ready to jump out of my chest. Only watching the battle from the trench little by little distracted me from anxious reflections. There was shooting coming from below Bor, but we could not understand what was going on there. By evening we saw that the company was running to its positions, and only when the men jumped into the trenches, the enemy opened a belated rare mortar fire which could not do any harm. After the company went into defense, Yurchenko and I looked into my dugout. There were Selivanov, 2 soldiers from his squad, Bogdanov, and 2 frightened Germans. One of them had huge lanterns under his eyes. Selivanov sat aside on the bunk and stroked his left hand. Bogdanov laid out on the table the scheme of the alleged German defences and, poking his finger into it, tried to get from the Germans what was located where. His vocabulary of German was such that the Germans did not understand what the lieutenant demanded of them. This went on for about 10 minutes. Sweating from the incredible labour, Bogdanov angrily cursed. If he knew that with these creatures we'll have to talk, then at school for excellent would learn their dog language. It's easier to go to the attack 10 times than to talk to them. Bogdanov was angry with himself. He told Selivanov to take the Germans to the battalion headquarters and himself went out after them. The soldiers told in detail what was happening to the company in Belibor, when it was stopped by machine gun fire and then covered by mortar fire. Bogdanov made the most correct decision in this situation. He rushed the unit under the cliff where there was a dead zone for machine guns, but the Germans decided to get the company with mines. When they began to burst at the foot of the cliff, several soldiers were wounded by shrapnel, and then Bogdanov took a desperate step, deciding to rush into the first line of German defences. The enemy did not expect this. Seconds of confusion decided the matter. Hand-to-hand combat in the trenches was not in favour of the Germans. There were a lot of machine guns, which were turned the other way and helped the company to repel several attacks of the Germans from the second line of defence. However, the strength to attack themselves was not enough. Bogdanov hoped that other companies would break into the village, but time was running out and losses were mounting as the Germans were firing hard at ours with machine guns. After holding on for 3 hours, Bogdanov realized that it was useless to wait for the situation to change and decided to throw the company into his own defense. And this, too, was a surprise for the Germans. That's why their mortar fire was late. The Germans were captured when we broke into their line of defense. One of them rushed at Selivanov with a knife, but he managed to intercept his hand and squeeze it hard. Then the German clamped his teeth into Selivanov's arm. The enraged fighter began to hammer the German and gave him flashlights. If not for Bogdanov, as the fighters said, Selivanov would have shaken the soul out of the German. Here we realized why our bogatier was stroking his hand. Having escorted the Germans to the headquarters, he returned to the dugout with a bandaged hand. The guys began to make fun of him. "What, Selivanov, are you going to the rear, to the hospital? Did the German beat you well with his teeth?" The soldiers laughed. I asked my orderly to treat it, so to speak, for prophylaxis. They say that the Krauts have poisonous saliva like a rabid dog, good-naturedly parried Selivanov's joke. Late in the evening, Bogdanov came into the dugout, and with him some senior lieutenant. I thought I had seen him somewhere. When I looked closely, I recognized him. It was Sajin. The same Sajin, whose company was defending a high-rise near the station and was the last in the regiment to leave the position. "Are you already a senior lieutenant?" I asked. Sajin looked at me carefully and suddenly broke into a smile. I remembered. "How did you get from us?" he asked. Bogdanov looked at me sternly and expressively, saying, "Cut it out, it's not about that now." They began to discuss how tomorrow they will lead an offensive on Belibor. Bogdanov ordered Yurchenko to take advantage of the darkness to organize the delivery of mines for tomorrow's offensive, and said that perhaps he would take me, as the first platoon needs a commander. Sajin stayed with us in the dugout for a short time. From his conversation with Bogdanov, I could understand that they had studied at the same school. He came here from where we came from. His unit was later sent for reforming. But since our battalion was not replenished with personnel, a reinforced company was promptly formed in the village. It was sent under the command of Sajin to replenish our battalion. Both commanders smelled of vodka. Apparently, they managed to drink in joy in honor of the meeting. After Sajin's departure, Bogdanov had had a good time, and he became talkative, though his mood was a little agitated. It turns out that the battalion headquarters was visited by the regimental commander. He ordered to call their company commanders to review the failures in the offensive on Belibor. Instead of reviewing, the lieutenant colonel organized a complete route. He threatened to remove Captain Dementiev from command of the battalion. And this squirmy little fellow was singing along, Bogdanov said. Everyone understood that he was referring to Senior Lieutenant Ryabinin, whom he himself disliked. From the lieutenant we learned that the reinforced company, consisting of 4 rifle and 1 machine gun platoon, at night will go to the initial lines and will be our neighbour on the right flank. This company is now behind the berm over which we crossed during the night, entering our positions. Bogdanov said that the offensive promised to support the fire of a battery of 75mm guns, but he does not really believe in it. Yurchenko came back and reported that the mortars moved from behind the berm to the firing positions, all the mines released for tomorrow's battle. Look, tomorrow will be a hotter day. I hope you won't be late with the fire, Bogdanov instructed Yurchenko. Having put out a cigar on a tin can which served as an ashtray, Bogdanov left the dugout. In the morning, October 21, we rose long before dawn. The ascent was quiet. The mortar's firing position was moved from the previous place to the left in a shallow hollow. We had to reach it almost by feel, as it was thick darkness. Soon a messenger from the company commander appeared at the mortar firing position. He told me to go urgently to Bogdanov's command post. Where he is, I did not know. The messenger took to escort me. Bogdanov's command post was behind a small hillock. The lieutenant was lying behind it with binoculars in his hands. He put his automatic rifle next to it. The binoculars were not needed. Bogdanov twirled it and put it in the case. Seeing me, it told me to be near him to communicate with the mortars, who were to change firing positions. Looking at the clock with a luminous dial, Bogdanov said that before the beginning of the offensive is still half an hour, and suddenly, unexpectedly for all, artillery struck the German positions. By the explosions, it was evident that it was working the edge of the cliff and the first-line defences. The Germans did not return fire. Was not. Crumpling his cap, Bogdanov stood up and shouted to the messengers. Tell the platoon commanders to rush the platoons under the cliff where they were yesterday. While there was artillery fire, the company managed to get to the cliff. At this time, our mortars hit the first line of enemy defences. In all probability, after yesterday's failure, the Germans thought that we would not soon go to Belibor and therefore were not ready to meet us. The company took the first line of defence quickly and almost without losses. The second line of defence was fighting back hard, although the battery hit it, but the effect was little. Fire corrected poorly. The company 3 times went up to the attack and each time came back. Bogdanov several times swore at Sazhin, from whose company he expected good support from the right flank. Unable to stand it, Bogdanov ordered me to go back and tell Yurchenko to tell the mortars to move to the houses that stand on the bank of the cliff, and from behind them to fire at the enemy. Sazhin's company did not delay. It went on the offensive at the signal green rocket, as was agreed the day before at the battalion headquarters. Bogdanov was in a hurry, but he gained a lot by it. Later little bit, the company would have to mess with the first line of defense. From the new positions of fire, our mortars became more effective. The platoon had an opportunity to improve the adjustment of fire from the burned attic of the house, from the basement of which Selivanov yesterday smoked out machine gunners. The mortars managed to suppress almost all machine gun points of the second line of defense in front of the first platoon. At Bogdanov's command, the fighters rose to the attack and again sprinted back to the trenches. The second line of defense ran along a wide street that split the village in 2. In the middle of the village, on the square, stood an old stone house with a turret. It was either an old bell tower or a fire tower. 2 machine guns were beating from there. One of them was a large caliber machine gun. They did not allow the first platoon to raise their heads. Lieutenant Bogdanov again sent me to Yurchenko with the order that the mortars silence the machine guns in the turret. The platoon concentrated all the fire on the house with the turret. Its iron roof was all in shreds, but the machine guns continued to hold the company. The turret had an all-around view, and since the streets diverged in a fan from the square, the enemy machine gunners controlled the entire village from here. If there had been at least a light tank, we could have gotten closer, hit, and the matter is over. I reasoned, sending from the machine gun in the turret one line after another. What the hell did he want? Tank? Run back to Yushchenko and together with him organize the fire, shouted Bogdanov. I gave Yushchenko the commander's order. He spread his hands and said that the mines were running out. Then he spat and told me to pull one mortar into the gap between the houses, from where you can see the house with a turret. He himself became the gunner. With the third mortar he hit the dome. It tore the iron on the roof, and the machine guns fell silent. The platoon went up to the attack and fought in the enemy trenches. The third platoon on the right also went up, but at that time the machine guns on the turret started talking again. Yushchenko again stood behind the gunner. The fourth mine broke through the ceiling and threw a large-caliber machine gun into the square. The other was silenced forever. Seeing this, and the third platoon rose to the attack and broke into the trenches of the second line of enemy defences. The Germans jumped out of the trenches and rolled back to the outskirts of the village. But they clung to every house, stubbornly shot back. That's why the further advance of the company was slow. We had to smoke the Germans out of individual houses with grenades. We were crowding the enemy, and he rolled back to the outskirts. At that time 4 cars appeared on the road around the village. German soldiers jumped out of them and lay down in a ditch. Thick machine gun fire stopped us. We lay low and then began to withdraw back. At that time from the right flank we heard a resounding hurrah. It was Sarshin's company. The Germans trembled, and first some soldiers, and then all ran to the left, where they were bound to run into the third company. I jumped out from behind the fence, gave a long line in pursuit of the fleeing, and immediately felt how my right temple burned. A white mist covered my eyes. I grabbed my temple with my hand, feeling something sticky and warm. One of the fighters jumped up to me, didn't let me fall. This, as I realized, was the company's medical officer. Bring him quickly to the rear and send him to the sanitary unit. I heard Bogdanov's voice. At that time the orderly was dressing my wound. I tried to get up, and only after the third attempt I got on my feet. I went to the rear, supported by the orderly. Having descended from the cliff, I felt better and said that I could go without his help. Do you know where? He asked and told me how to get to the sanitary unit. It turned out to be far away, behind the berm we had crossed at night a few days before. I felt dizzy and wobbly. I felt like I was about to pass out. But then it started to clear up again, and it was as if I had strength. It seemed to me that I had been walking for a very long time. Am I lost? Flashed through my mind. At that time a young junior lieutenant appeared in front of my eyes, covered with new belts. Where are you going? He shouted at me. You see, I'm wounded. Where is the sanitary unit? I asked and lost consciousness. I don't know what happened next. I regained full consciousness only in Yaroslavl in the hospital. The wound, which seemed trifling to me at first, actually turned out to be very serious. Until the end of 1942, I was in various hospitals. I had constant headaches that made me lose consciousness. My legs were taken away 3 times, and I had to learn to walk again. My hands were not functioning well. The question did not leave me. How to live further, what to do. After all, I, taken into the army from school, did not have any specialty, and besides I was just an invalid. But medicine and youth did their job. Gradually I began to get rid of ailments. My confidence grew. From the first letters from my relatives I learned that my brother Ivan was drafted into the army and became a tanker. On his car he will reach Berlin. And for all my life I remembered the village of Bailey Bor, October 21, 1941. The village where many of my fellow soldiers and comrades died. It was the first village repulsed from the Germans with my participation. A village where so long accompanying me luck and good fortune suddenly turned away from me. In this village I finished my war journey.